France might be a country under lockdown, but still, some things are sacred. Good cheese, fine wine, freshly baked bread. With restaurants closed, customers come to this butcher's for their comfort food and another precious commodity, company.
Très coupé du monde, hein. Ils nous remercient d'être là pour eux, qu'on leur apporte des bons produits, et voilà, et puis le dialogue.
And here in France, no steak is served without a little wine. And stuck inside, people are drinking more. Small independent vendors like this wine shop have recently been allowed to reopen. In this tight community in the heart of Paris, which locals fondly call the village, wine seller RAYMOND-YVES was overwhelmed by the reception he received when he got back to work.
J'ai décidé de rouvrir la boutique et tous les clients à moi étaient tellement contents de me revoir. Ils m'ont même applaudi comme les infirmières. J'étais même étonné.
The warm welcome hasn't eased his worries about the future, though.
Espérons seront encore là, mais j'ai peur pour beaucoup d'indépendants qui ne vont pas déposer le bilan. C'est surtout ça, j'ai peur. Et dans le monde entier, parce que c'est pas que en France, je crois.
A short walk away, this bakery is already feeling the knock-on effects of lockdown. Parisians who can have swapped the confines of the city for the country. This baker's profits have plunged by 80%. He's had to make some painful decisions.
On a dû se séparer de 7 personnes. Et là, maintenant, on n'est plus qu'à 3, mais bon, voilà, c'est bizarre, c'est tout vide.
These street cafes usually would be overflowing with locals and tourists alike. After all, this is the very square where American writer Ernest Hemingway would come to sip his coffee or his wine when he lived here in the 1920s. Under lockdown, of course, it is quieter, but the question is, what happens next? France is now a country which has officially entered into recession. The country's just posted its worst economic quarter since 1945, when Europe had been ravaged by 6 years of war. Just down the street, the devastating economic impact of coronavirus is already plain to see. The Church of Saint-Médard has set up a food bank during the pandemic. The lunchtime queue for one of these blue bags, humbly filled with bread, yogurt, fruit and water, grows longer by the minute. Some of those lining up are people the parish priest says he never expected to meet.
Et ce qu'il y a de particulier là dans cette distribution, c'est que des gens arrivent qui ont des logements, mais économiquement ils passent entre les mailles, ils n'ont pas d'aide et donc du coup ils n'arrivent plus à se nourrir.
Here in Paris, the fight is on to save a cherished way of life. But it's more than that. It's a fight to ensure no one goes without the bread that keeps this country and its people going.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.